Mick Hesselin, born in Matara, 1936, educated at Matara Primary School, then came to Invercargill by bus every day for 2.5 years to attend Southland Technical College. Worked in Hamilton for a couple of years at least, and lived in Auckland for 3 years and attended part-time university and carried on there. Completed that and came back. At that time I was in total control of the design and the contract construction of the new railway station in Invercargill. So I came back right in time for the opening by Robert Muldoon. Always keen on heritage in Invercargill. I'm now in the Heritage South on the Invercargill City Art Gallery, and I'm still a member of Troopers Memorial Trust, who redeveloped both the former Bank of New South Wales on the corner of D and Tay, and also Yule House. Well, the main thing I find is most people don't really look up. The wealthy take off overseas to look at heritage all over the world and come back and think they've got nothing in this place. I can understand that because we're a young country, but we have got the basis of our heritage beginnings here already. And what we have in this town is quite surprising because it's all a result of the gold rush. And the architects that came, they came from all over the world and did some magnificent work. Started doing the tours when we developed the Heritage South team, and we opted for this Heritage Month every year. But one of the things we decided that to bring the buildings up to people's attention, just to do an evening walking tour, walking along one side of the street, discussing all the buildings on the other. I also included all the dirty little alleyways and not areas that most of the public have ever been in. Just as a piece of interest, because I think you've got to have that local interest and naughty stories, things like this involved a bit of sex, a bit of scandal. It sells. We always had good crowds. There'd be mostly on an average of about 30 people, things like that all the time. So it was good. You're going to do your spiel, haven't you? Oh, yes.
And I'd just like to welcome you all along this afternoon for this swan song tour of the CBD block before the demolition begins.
My name is Mick Hesselin. I'm a retired architect. I'm a Southlander. I've been interested in heritage after 40 years with the Southland branch of Historic Places Society. But welcome to you all. Thank you all for coming along. It's always a hell of a surprise just to see what the silent majority of Invercargill are really interested in. This project is a long-term project. They're planning on 5 stages for demolition and construction. The buildings have been empty for quite a few years now, so the decline is evident. The street kids have got in and done everything that they want to do, and I don't know whether they've got parents at all or whether they really are what we call the word beginning with B, little B's. But they've had a fair go. So we'll start the tour. The former Government Life building. It's actually 2 buildings to begin with. This building here is known as the Lewis Building, and that is 1914 it was built. It was designed by Christchurch architects, Sanscombe and McDowell Smith. They came to Invercargill and only did 3 buildings over the time here. One was the grandstand and the showground. The second one was the little Canton Coffee building along D Street. near Farmer's Building, which is a brick building. They concentrated more on detail and design than the actual strength and structural value of the building. That's my feeling. I've always felt this is a very sick building. The developers, the Lewis family that built this building, then went on in 1928 and had this building built. And this was designed by a Christchurch architect, Benjamin J. Agar. The fact about the Lewis building, the only redeeming fact about it is it's the first elderly building in Invercargill with a flat roof on it. There's no gabled roofs. Invercargill is all gabled roofs to get the water off. There's so much of it down here, we've got to get it off quickly. This is the first building of any age that has a flat roof. It's not quite flat, it's just a very low-pitched corrugated iron roof on top. So the family decided they'd build this, bought all the buildings, original buildings on this corner, and build this corner building. So they combined the two buildings together, and the lift and the staircase for both buildings is in the older building, 1914. I doubt if there would be a lift in that building at that stage when it was built. So whether it was put in and went right through to cover both buildings' height, I'm not quite sure. But the lift tower goes up from this building through and services both buildings. The corner building is very early Art Deco. It was built in 1928 by a building group who knew that we did have earthquakes and put steel in the concrete. Nowhere near what is required to today's regulations, where we have more bloody steel than we have concrete. It stood very well until 8 years ago. An engineer, a local engineer, took the corner column out on the ground floor, right here. And you can see the results of the movement in the building with the strapping on the vertical columns between windows, and you can see where the windows are breaking because of the movement in the building. So it's become dangerous. Very early Art Deco style, as I say. The top floor was run as a restaurant by the Lewis family, along with the top floor of their building here. Later on, a person called Dorothy Patterson, a woman in Invercargill, decided to run the restaurant up the top here, and she turned it into the top tea rooms in Invercargill. It had potted palms, it was luxury, and we had the fur stoles, we had the hats, matching gloves and shoes, and we had the best of the wives of Invercargill up there every day having cups of tea, cake stands, the lot. It's a brilliant area because you look right over Southland from the top floor looking north. You look right over the airport to the west, and you have a beautiful view of Bluff from the south side. So it was a beautiful area. The colour scheme of it was done by one of the architects in my office years ago, and he came up with this colour scheme. So they painted it, and I said, right, we've got a new name for it, the licorice ore sort. But the colour has stood very, very well. I think it has attracted things, and it is a very good viewing building coming down D Street. It's quite a pleasant building. But we say farewell to that one. This Lewis building next to it here is something totally unusual. Brick walls, it's wooden flooring, it's supported on steel beams and steel columns all the way through. The front is not brick, not concrete, but limestone. The structural quality was stuffed up in the 1940s when the licensing trust built the Brown Owl restaurant in the ground floor, and they stripped all the partitions and walls out on the ground floor and left the whole 3 or 4 story building waving around over a big space. You can't do that in buildings, not really. They didn't know in those days, so they tried it. Surprisingly, it's still standing. You'll notice the lion heads supporting the cantilevered veranda, and the cantilevered veranda, of course, puts an extra weight and structural problem onto the face of the building. The steel work in those supports is quite beautiful. That's our government life building. You can see the growth on the top as a result of it being limestone. We've got the manure, we've got the bird poo, we've got the pigeons, everything's going. So We'll now move on to the next one. This is known as the Coxhead building, and its age is 1875. That's not a bad age in an earthquake-prone country. But a very symmetrical building. It was designed by Burwell, as I say, a very prominent architect in Invercargill. But this one here, we're going to say the facade. Originally on the top parapet, after the 1930 Napier earthquake, all the fancy work had to be taken off, and there were 4 great huge urns on the 2 side panels up the top. So they were removed, but the rest of the parapet stayed, including the shell relief and things like that. Quite an ornate building in a quiet way, nicely balanced with a central panel of windows, and in each case I believe there was an entrance off the street into the various areas of the building. So a very balanced building. The whole facade is pretty original, so that's an excellent one. So we're now on another little building here that looks delightfully modern, and everybody thinks it's nice and sharp and young and God knows what else. Its actual age is 1877, the ground floor. Top floor was put on in 1883. So they must have either had a good year or the business was good or something to be able to go and do that in those days. They did. The facade alterations occurred in 1943, and I've got a sneaking suspicion that it was A.C. Ford, a local architect. The date sounds right and the style is right because he was commissioned to do these buildings that had these ornate facades and brought back to something that was structurally okay and wouldn't fall on your head. I think it's A.C. Ford by the little touches of Art Deco across the top of the windows. I look at the entry door on the ground floor, and if you can get past the bright red, the vertical columning and on the columns, the plaster finish there, sort of all points to A.C. Ford from that point of view. A very old building. And the next one has the name of Temple Chambers. That is 1881. Architect was Angus Kerr. It was fire damaged in 1896, and it was reconstructed in the 2-storey form by William Sharp. Now, William Sharp was the architect engineer that did the water tower. There are little Art Deco touches down the 2 edges where it adjoins the 2 buildings. The fire escape and the windows are, I would say, original. Metal windows have been put in when that frontage was redesigned. It's very quiet, it's mundane, it doesn't make you dance up and down and get excited, but it's sitting there as a wee building, very, very old. Right, we move on to this building, which is I would say late 1800s, 1900 at the very latest. A very balanced building in design. The gable portico entrance is a modern addition along with the columns. The parapet has been ripped off and strengthened, so that would be in the 1930s. The detailing in it is limited to the 2 ends and the central panel, plus the curves over the top of the windows. So not a bad building, and it's been through a whole multitude of uses over its life. Once again, our cantilevered veranda handled very, very well, and you can see the twists in the steel rods, not just a piece of steel going from A to B. They have had some engineers shown his talent and what he could do at the time, which is good. It shows a pride in workmanship, and boy, believe me, when these buildings were built, there was a pride in workmanship. So you've got to think about this every time you look at these buildings and think there was an awful lot of labour at probably a very minimal wage to get these buildings done. But they built these buildings. Damn sight braver than today. We're now on to the former New Zealand Insurance building. This is 1884. The architect was E.R. Wilson, a local guy who did the town hall frontage on Tay Street, did most of St John's Church, things like that. This building, it is balanced in some ways, but there's an unusual feature where the main entrance used to be. It's off-centre. But everything on the top floor is balanced. It has Corinthian columns, it has everything that the good plasterers could do, and it includes a bronze clock projecting at right angles on the front wall, which was an important thing years ago in Invercargill because very few people had watches. Only the old people had pocket watches. They could only ones that could afford them. So a timepiece on the street was pretty important. I worked in this street years ago in the 60s, 70s. As far as I can remember, I don't think the clock even went then. I'm not sure, but every now and then there was supposed to be a bit of maintenance done on it, but it might have lasted for a day and then conked out again. But the plastering effect for the main entrance, the name is very proudly done. Everything is picked up in quite a quiet colour scheme that does very, very well. Double hung wooden windows. The veranda is a modern addition, and it was done by John McCulloch in the 60s, 70s, somewhere around about there. Very modern for its time. All the water discharges off the glass and goes into the big gutter at the back, and I've never seen the front of the building being covered with a waterfall. And there's a lovely little bridge connection between the two buildings that was done also by John McCulloch to tie the top floors together and make them work better. So everybody has had a wee bit of a go at it, and it's survived, and it's looking not bad at all. And we all had flagpoles, most important, very patriotic, and flags were essential. So yeah, times have changed. We're now in front of a building that was done in 1987, and it was done after a massive building, the Ross and Glendenning's warehouse building in here, went on fire and disappeared. So somebody came in and decided to do what I call a little piece of cottagey architecture. If you like curves, if you like little angles, if you like triangles, if you like everything like that, very nice, but really doesn't come off in the centre of a city, more in a suburban mall area or something like that. I'm very grateful for the tree in front of it. However, and this was classed as sort of modern, it was done by a group called architects called Mitchell and Mitchell. They're not from here, I don't know where they came from, but I believe it was an insurance company that commissioned the building, so they would buy anybody that they worked with anywhere through the country. Right, we're now on to the Cambridge buildings. The research that the Richardson Group have had done on this whole block takes a book about 2.5 to 3 inches thick. I've been through it. I've picked up a lot of information, and I've picked up a lot of things that I don't agree with. One of them says that A.C. Ford, who did this Cambridge arcade, demolished all the buildings that were here to build the arcade. Now, there's a photograph of a very ornate building on this site. I think that A.C. Ford stripped the top of that building down to a certain height and then did the whole facade, because the original building featured a balcony, it featured the curved windows all the way through, but from there on it went as sort of two separate buildings, quite strange. So that's the background story. I think this is a very original frontage that's been done after the Napier earthquake, and in the 1930s. Cambridge Arcade was always a walkway. In the middle of the block was a blacksmith shop and semi-industrial industries and businesses and things like this. The blacksmith shop went up in fire and set a bit of the rest on fire too. So the whole lot was sitting here for a wee while. And then a very wealthy backcountry farmer from up either North Otago or South Canterbury, a chap called Cowie Nichols, Colonel Cowie Nichols. Now that tells you everything, doesn't it? An Englishman from the First World War, a military man, a Cambridge University man. So he came and he saw this property was available and he purchased it. And he appointed A.C. Ford to do this development for him. So A.C. created something that is a very good gem of Art Deco. Originally it had a pond in the middle of it, with lights at each end of it. It even had fish in it, I think, for a few days. It had featured plastered concrete patterns in the floor. It featured lovely oak timber detailed joinery in the window shop frontages. and lots of LED light in the Art Deco style. He really went overboard on the outside here with his Art Deco detailing. And of course the little piece between the Cambridge building sign up there is for the flagpole. Some sods nicked it. We still have the balcony, we have the windows, but over the top of each curved window we have the face of supposed to be Apollo. I don't know whether it was or whether it was the milkman or the fireman or who it was, but he looks the same on every one, so they must have had a very good casting done of it. The detailing is very good Art Deco, including this sort of rippled, wavy plaster detail around the balcony. Everything like that is a beautiful example of Art Deco. And the whole arcade was a beautiful example of Art Deco. So it's rather a pity. I think it's very pleasant. I like the tree in front of it. It all adds up together to a lovely complex. This building is probably one of the younger buildings in the street. The Nichols building, it is known as. It was done by A.C. Ford in 1929. And as you see, it's a very pleasant balance of good Art Deco design. Windows are plain on each side, but a feature made of the central panel of windows. The decoration going surrounding those central windows, the decoration running horizontally on the parapet, and even the shape of the parapet at the top is all a brilliant feature of positive, relatively plain Art Deco. Beautifully handled. It's just the front portion of this building. Behind this building is the original sort of shed type structure, but the whole frontage of this is 1929, so it's probably one of the youngest in the street. Steel windows, even the Art Deco design featured in the fan lights of the steel windows. Fire escapes handled quite pleasantly. The handrails were okay when you're going vertically, but not much help when you're getting through the window. But they're there. Everything nice and plain and good. A very quiet colour scheme where you can appreciate the styling, the detailing and the plaster. If that was all picked up in colour, it would be a dog's breakfast. And in good design, you rely on the light and shade of the natural sun and all those sort of elements in a building to make you really appreciate it. It doesn't need to be tarted up. So, a relatively young building, it's sad to see that one go. Right, we're now in front of the Southland Times building. Built in 1929, designed by C.H. Roberts, a local architect who did a lot of housing and quite a few commercial buildings in the centre of town too. A lovely balanced building, and it does show the brickwork. Instead of plastering everything, it does feature the plastered panels as an emphasis to that brickwork. A bay window, a lovely shell motif at the top of it, and the shell motif was an in thing with plasterers. The plasterers in Invercargill at that time were brilliant tradesmen. They really were brilliant tradesmen. You can see on all our buildings, they were proud of their trade and they did their very best on them. The wreaths of flowers, the columns, and even the windows with the columns and the deep curved top over the top of them, and all that sort of thing is quite brilliant. It's actually, in my mind, a little bit of Venice. If you look at that building, and if you can imagine a canal with a gondola going hurtling past here, this is a facade that they're planning on keeping. It does have a historic places registration plaque on it, on the wall there. It did have lovely brass signboards on each side of the door with Southland Times. Somebody's blogged that. Of course, originally beside the Times building was the Invercargill police station.
Been there?
Yes, so you can see that everything that happened in the police station was fully reported in the paper next day. You just had to hand it through the window. It was brilliant. But anyway, the police station decided to move to a new area, and they demolished the old building. When that building was demolished, the Southland Times decided they needed a bit more space. So Lou Simpson was the architect for this addition, and the only thing he sort of related to in the original building was curved tops on the top floor windows. Nothing is in balance, nothing even creates any sort of appreciation of what it's sitting next door to. It'd be better to go on to something totally different. And as for the suspended veranda out at the front, it's not pretty at all. Tantalised pine in the middle of the city doesn't stand up to things too well. This Southland Times building is a beautiful building in Essex Street. While we're walking to the corner, we can study the back of the Kelvin Hotel. This building is Arthur Milne, architect. Built in 1965, state-of-the-art, multi-storey building, first one in Invercargill, very, very high, bit of everything on it. We put brick on it, we put curtain walling and panels, we did everything we possibly could on the thing. And then, of course, all the necessities arrived of air ventilation and a few things like that. So that had to be tacked up the tower on the southwest corner. The thing was very, very standardised in dimensions inside. The bedrooms were 3.6 square. Then they had a toilet and a shower and a bathroom or something off it. They were pretty boring, but that was the state of the day. You were monopolised by standard dimensions. You weren't allowed to do anything above that because it would be more expensive. I don't know whether the licensing trust realised or not, but they suddenly found that, right, there's a footpath out here and we've had to provide a veranda in the past over this. Why can't we build out over the footpath? Somehow they got agreement with the council and did it. And then they put a curved piece in the corner because the building straight opposite here on the other Kelvin Street corner here, an engineer did a curved construction on the corner of that building. So, boy, we've got to have one of them. So away we go, and they got one. It did have balconies and all that sort of thing projecting right on the corner, but it stood here, served its purpose, I suppose. And then we come on to our lovely little Thompson building. This was built in 1913, 2 floors, and it was originally called the Thompson's Dining Room. It was redeveloped in 1929, and my thoughts are that 1929 date comes in with the Art Deco style. And if that's possible, A.C. Ford might have done this building too because of the detailing. I'm not sure, but we can't confirm that. But it is a lovely piece of Art Deco. The colour scheme is very, very quiet, but it does accentuate the points that are necessary, like the 2 details on the side panels, the Thompson sign, beautifully done, the parapet, the way it's done, the detailing over the windows, the vertical divisions between the windows coming down from the top to a third of the height, and even the Art Deco details in the fan lights of the windows. Steel windows, very nicely handled little cantilevered veranda, quite a respectable fire escape that doesn't really take away from the front of the building too much, a necessity that was added later on, but it's there. It is a lovely piece of Art Deco. Then we move on to the booze corner. But to me it was always known as the Cecil Hotel. But when you look at it, it's very old. And when you research it, it is very old, from 1899 to 1900. The corner was the original part, but it was a series of adjoining buildings, but they were all hotels. And there are 4 hotels names mentioned in this block. There was the New Provincial, there was the Scandinavian Hotel, there was the Caledonian Hotel, and there was the Supreme Court Hotel. Now, Invercargill was awash with booze. There were pubs everywhere, and they all drank. And then Prohibition came in 1904. That stuffed everything. So these buildings were very ornate. They're old, as I say. So then they turned into sort of accommodation, and then the licensing trust bought it and turned it into the Cecil Hotel, which was on that corner part where the radio station is. You'll notice the detailing of the building. The windows are all sort of at reasonable centres all the way along the top floor. It has been remodelled to bring it down to a more plainer standard over the years. But you'll notice straight opposite here, there's detailings of a couple of columns going up, forming a sort of a major entranceway in the middle of the building there. Then you'll come along to this curved part here where the veranda goes up over a curve. That was the area where the horses and carts went through and delivered the booze in the back and did all that sort of thing into these pubs. So that suddenly became a little shop. If you study the veranda posts, they'll give you a pretty good indication that it's way pre-1900. Very ornate, cast iron, beautifully detailed, but the big problem was that they made the veranda post in cast iron, they made it hollow. And they brought the veranda, the spouting downpipe down from the spouting and fed it into the veranda post. And then at the end, base of the veranda post, they put a little outlet for it to piddle into the gutter at the street. They forgot that water rusts cast iron inside if it doesn't get any air through it and things like this. So cars parking in the street, if they nudged one of those, there was a heap of rusted metal all over the place. In my early years, we used to have a beer on a Friday night in here in the Cecil. You went upstairs, round, through and under, then you went downstairs and you got into the bar. And it was a long, cramped area, bar on one side for the full length and us on the other. Then, of course, they'd run out of beer. So the barrel was brought in from some remote part of the building. It was rolled along the hallway, down these stairs, entry into the bar. Right, you all had to move against the window while the beer was rolled into the end of the bar and round. It was quite an effort. 2 or 3 beers and it became a sort of an expedition. It really was something. But it was fun. Okay, we're now looking at the south end of the booze centre of Invercargill, and the little building on the west end of the booze centre, this little whoosh building, it's probably one of the oldest ones. That was the Scandinavian Hotel. This little building, same veranda detailing, sort of sagging badly towards the west end. Quite a bit of strange work done on the top of it. You look on the west side, there's a curved top cap on the parapet. On the other side, there's nothing. The detailing and balance is the same all the way through there, but if you come along where the gap is, and if you line yourself up with the gap between the buildings, just stand about here and have a look at the west wall of that building and the way that it curves out towards the north. Have a wee look. They don't build them like they used to, so there's only one place you can see it. It's there. Great curve in the brick wall. Next to it is what was known as the Allet Mewenson building. This was a very modern piece of architecture done by Arthur Milne in 1958. And it was done on the frontage of the site that was occupied by the original courthouse in Invercargill. And those of you of a certain age will probably remember the very foreboding 2-storey building with columns along the front, set back from the street, grey plaster finish, and very, very foreboding. It stood here for years, and then they built the new courthouse in Don Street. It still stood here for years until 1958 or 60. It was demolished, and this building was built. Quite a pleasant piece of modern architecture. It did have a sloping front to the veranda, quite nicely detailed. Now you can see the results of the street kids on the buildings. They get in everywhere, they tag and leave a tag on all the buildings, as many as they can, and apparently from what I understand, if one does it and puts his sign up, the other ones have to come along and match. It's a wee bit like dogs piddling on trees. Same mentality. I think the dog has got more mentality. We're now coming along to Zookeepers and what was formerly Macpac next door for a wee while. Zookeepers, famous for its elephant on the roof. These 2 buildings were the first two shops that the amalgamation of H&J Smith built before they moved over there. So this was the beginnings of H&J Smith's and these two shops. Quite old buildings. They were built in 1916 for zookeepers and 1910 for Macpac. The Macpac one, at one stage of its life, was Mackenzie's shop in Tay Street.
Oh, yes.
And everybody's children will remember Mackenzie's shop. Everything was at a kid's eye level. Everything was what you wanted. Mackenzie's and Woolworths, yes. Real kid treasures places. So these two shops have a pretty important history. While we're here, we'll talk about the Herbert Haynes building. This is 1884 to 1885, the basic building. And then, of course, when A.C. Ford got involved with the Cambridge Arcade next door, he pleaded with them to open the west side of their building, which was a blank boundary wall. He pleaded with them to put display windows in that wall that opened into the arcade so that they could become part of it. Even though they had nothing to do with it financially or business-wise or anything at all, they could become part of the arcade. And they went along with the idea and did it. So Herbert Haynes came in here and they ran a very, very good shop. A.C. Ford, when he did the Cambridge Arcade, he must have impressed them, or he sold a good story to them, because he got the commission to modernise the whole front of their building. It doesn't look good with painted out windows and things like this, but it was a very quiet piece of Art Deco restoration over an existing building, and it worked quite well. The little bit of bronze work there in the middle with an Art Deco detailing in it. The worst thing that was possibly done, but it did help the entrance down below, was putting the glazing in the street veranda. So we had pubs along the corner, we had drapery and everything else in this part. Everything was to hand. So we look at the south end of Cambridge Arcade, very narrow, but once again it has the raised canopy entrance expression on the street veranda. The veranda posts are just as old as the adjoining ones in the Herbert Haynes buildings, but they have had a bit of decoration removed and things like this. Quite a pleasant arcade facade, very, very balanced and nicely detailed. The Cambridge Arcade is 1934, sort of an Edwardian frontage, but a majority of Art Deco. And he handled the parapets very, very pleasantly, not just a straight line, nothing like that. Just a wee bit of a stepping in them, and lettering done very, very well. And I must admit, I've always admired the quality of the plasterers' workmanship in these buildings. They were champions. We come along from the Cambridge Arcade entry, the south end, and we come onto what we call the Just Incredible. It was done by Carter's, a drapery firm, curtain walling over a building from about 1910 as far as we can make out. Nothing much remains. Signwriter's skill has won. It takes your eye more than anything else. But however, that's advertising, that's signwriting. Peter McConville, a very good signwriter in Invercargill, once told me in our office that architects, their only bloody use was to build buildings for signwriters to put signs on. And I often look at those sort of things and thinking, Peter, you're right. Curtain walling was a state of the art. It was aluminium members and sheet of glass and this sort of thing. But it was modern, state of the art, got to have one of those. Now the next little building beside the Just Incredible is known as the Annie Ibbotson building. Built in 1933, and the architect was Broderick. That must have been one of his only pieces of Art Deco. Broderick did the Wales Bank. Broderick did the National Bank diagonally opposite on the corner of the Crescent and Clyde Street. Broderick did Alexandra House in the corner of Don and D Street. Broderick did the Grand Hotel. Broderick was quite a guy. They are all terrifically different buildings, and he did them exceedingly well. In fact, I think his Alexandra building, the brick one on the corner of Don Street, is one of the buildings that we've just got to keep in Invercargill. We'll never ever see anything like that again. A very good architect, came from a very good family. The Broderick family started the Invercargill Savings Bank in Don Street. Then we go next door to the D.T. Carter building. The original facade had been removed totally on this building, and it was faced with this corrugated iron frontage in 1960. Very little of the original building remains, and it sits there in its isolated little self, filling a gap, and yeah, I think it's due for demolition. We'll look back towards the red and white Snap Fitness building, which was built in 1887. A balanced top, a bit of Art Deco on top of it, so somebody's had a go at taking the parapet off and remodelling it. But you can see on the west end in the corner there, the original parts of the building. See the detailed plasterwork right up the corner there? I don't know whether that's in a building that was adjoining it and has been stuck onto that building and never got removed. I'm not quite sure, but it does show that it was part of a very old setup. And I also believe that this is where W.H. Boys first set up shop when they arrived in Invercargill to see how the market would treat them. So they set up shop in this one, and then later on, when they were a bit more successful, they moved into the larger premises on the east side of the Cambridge Arcade. So that's about it. As I say, it's been changed into sort of Art Deco with the horizontal moulding over the windows, a bit of detailing along the top, and then we have that real original old piece of heritage hanging on the west end. Then we come to Hannah's. This is really something. There was an ornate building here. It got demolished, and then they thought, well, we need a shop in Invercargill, what are we going to do? So this is what I call utilitarian architecture. Oh, you need a room about this size, you need a glass front facing the street, you need a veranda over the footpath, and it's only single story, so how can we make it look bigger? Oh, we'll stick a couple of concrete panels up each side of it, and we'll put a great horizontal sign that we've got to brace because it might blow away in the wind, and you can see the braces going back on each side. And this is pure utilitarian architecture, just to house a business for the business of being in that position in Invercargill. Aluminium frontage, yeah. To me, this is the Watson building. Probably the most gloomiest, boring building in my mind. It's old, quite old, 1877, two buildings, an unknown architect, but there was one architect in Invercargill called Cecil Barham, and Cecil decided that he would have his offices in that building. So he took it over and then he remodeled the building, and that's the result. We had vertical sort of accentuation to each side of the new steel windows. We have sort of an original veranda, a very original veranda, and that was it. And then you left it in grey plaster, and it got gloomier and dirtier and things like this over the years. And even on the brightest of days, it didn't give any lift to your spirit whatsoever. But it's there. Next door we have the former ANZ Bank building, which is now covered with everything. All the people of Invercargill and everything you want to know about the place, and all sorts of things, which I suppose brings a bit of colour, I'm not quite sure. But it's built in 1974. The design of the building is quite unusual for the time of 1974. If that building had been looked after and everything else and was visible to everybody, there could have been a possibility that Heritage New Zealand could look at that sort of building and say, this is a good example of 1970s architecture. Strange things about it, it's just a big square, ground floor right up to the ceiling, so it's virtually sort of a two-story high building inside. But then it has a mezzanine floor along the west side and the north side. The ANZ Bank moved out and that building sat empty. You can see the big piece of concrete sticking up through the roof. That huge sort of elongated U-shaped piece of concrete was purely built to hold the ANZ sign. Next door to it, of course, is the Wales Bank. In the 80s and goodness knows what else, the Wales Bank was in one hell of a mess. A gentleman who was really on the way up, and he bought it because he had a lot of sympathy for the building, but then his financial scene changed and he had to sell it. Next, a ruthless developer bought it. While he was in ownership of the thing, the building had 2 fires through it, and a third to half of the roof disappeared in the fires. So the building was sitting there with broken windows, pigeons flying in and out for a long, long time. But we took a foot of pigeon poo out of the top floor corridor. It was very, very sad. We carted everything out of the place, we restored it. We had a very good tenant with Pumpkin Patch in that building. And of course, Pumpkin Patch changed its background identity and another group took it over and failed. So we lost our tenancy in there. This is a 1904 building, 84% structural standard. A lovely building inside, a brilliant building to work on, and the main problem we had was putting the exterior colour on the building, because normally in Invercargill, if you have a facade that faces south, you have to do it in warm colours. If you have a facade that faces north, you have to do it in cool colours. We had a building that had the late, hot afternoon sun coming on the west wall, and we had the cold south wall. So we had to get a neutral colour scheme that fitted both scenes. We worked it out, and we selected one colour. And that building is done in 5 shades of one colour, apart from the maroon and gold lettering and horizontal strips. It's worked very, very well, and when the scaffolding was around it and it was all finished and painted, we took the screening that was on the scaffolding off, and there was silence from Invercargill, which means, A, you've done right, because if you hadn't, you would have had your ears torn off. This is quite a brilliant building. Invercargill was very fortunate. A, J.T. Thompson put the wide streets in, but he also developed a crescent. We were the only town in New Zealand that had a crescent for a long, long, long time. Right, we're all under shelter and we're feeling much better. We made a pedestrian crossing without lights and we haven't lost anybody. That's brilliant. But then we've got to realise that cars have brakes, we don't. You can see the Wales Bank from here. One of the things I'm going to explain to you about the building is it was a bank and a commercial enterprise built as a combined building. So the doorway from the D Street side led into a very ornate staircase and went up to a first floor area which was public offices. So there was a rental return coming off that bank for the bank. The corner was actually the main entrance to the bank when it first started, right facing southwest, and I was surprised at Broderick doing that. They soon found that that didn't work, so they filled up that corner, and the people come in, they took the shops out and created an entranceway through the D Street door, put a canopy from the adjoining building veranda along, and gave you a bit of shelter, but it was a pretty hard job to get your money deposited in there. Now the building to the north of the Wales Bank was known as the Ox Building. W.A. was a real estate agent in Invercargill years ago. I don't know whether anybody can recall him. This building was built in 1872, 1873, that's right. And then they decided that they would put a partial first floor on in 1964. So they did that on the top of it. And then they sort of remodeled the whole thing. But it's a very old building. It's a nothing building. It sits there. The one next to it, Valor. This is quite something. It did have an ornate parapet that's been removed, but if you look at the north side of it, there's a sheets of vertical corrugated iron going up closing off a little alleyway that went through, and is treated as a separate entranceway. So the alleyway was always part of the planning in this area. As I say, 1872. Then we come along to the Lumsden building. Same. So these three buildings are 1872. So the cream one next to the theatre complex, that was the Lumsden building. The first floor was added in 1876, so they must have been doing well to be able to do that. The side alterations in 1942, and the H. Smith were the architect of Smith, Rice and Lawrence, architects in Invercargill, so they did that remodeling. Then we have the theatre complex, which I call utilitarian architecture. Boxes to hold people to watch a film. So our next little building is a very old building. It has a sort of a, what would you call, past. Not a very good past, because in the later years it was taken over and turned into a pub called the Frog and Firkin. And I think if you booze and you say that loudly, it's the worst swear word you've ever heard. But anyway, that happened to the building. Very ornate, very old, but all the ornateness was taken over, taken off, and the three windows remain. The curved canvas canopies don't help, but it's there. So that's the tour of Invercargill, as much as I know. I'd like to thank you all for hanging on and being still here from when we started. I hope I haven't worn you out, haven't bored you, but it is time, and I'm pleased to see so many people realise what we're going to lose. So folks, thank you very much once again, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.